Good morning, everyone. We'll just wait a few more minutes to allow some participants to enter the room before we start. Okay. A very good morning to you all, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Trinidad and Tobago Bureau of Standards, it is my pleasure to welcome you all to the stakeholder consultation on our draft national standards for risk management. Coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, the words risk and business operations have been inherently intertwined, and we all know it and feel it in how we conduct the future of our business work. In today's world, where artificial intelligence is transforming industries, data security is becoming a growing concern, and climate change is evolving our occupational health and safety practices, identifying and mitigating risk is a key predictor of success for organizations. Recognizing the needs of industries and to foster the growth and advancement of businesses, TTBS has initiated the adoption of two international standards for risk management: ISO 31000 Risk Management Guidelines and ISO TS 31050 Risk Management Guidelines for Managing Emerging Risk to Enhance Resilience. These two documents provide users with guidance on integrating risk-based decision-making into an organization's governance, planning, policy development, values, and culture. ISO 31000 and ISO TS 31050 provide a principle-based system which can be customized to meet the specific needs and functions of any organization. Today's consultation was designed to raise awareness on the draft national standards for risk management and to solicit your feedback. I encourage each of you to share your experiences and expertise on risk assessment and mitigation in order to collectively enhance the relevance and effectiveness of these two proposed standards. With your support, we anticipate that this stakeholder consultation will be a great success. I wish you all the best in today's discussions. Okay, on your screen, you would be seeing our agenda for today's stakeholder consultation. We usually like to begin by grounding our work in understanding the standards development process so stakeholders can see where we are in the standards development process and where the next steps will be coming on to that. For that, we have Ms. Adrienne Stewart, a standards officer within the standardization division, to lead these discussions. Adrienne is a legend within the standards world. She has been in the standards development for close to 20 years, and prior to that, she has been involved in the industry and food sector for 15 years. She has served as a technical secretary for regional standards and is the former chair of the technical marketing committee at the CARICOM Regional Organization for Standards and Quality. Adrienne, we hand it over to you to discuss the national standards development process.
Thank you, Andrea. Let me just share. Okay, great. For a second there, I didn't know who you were talking about. But thank you for that wonderful introduction. This one, I'm just going to give a very brief synopsis on standards development process here at the Trans-Tobago Bureau of Standards. And that relates to the process mostly throughout the region and to some extent internationally as well. This is a snapshot of who we are at TTBS, our governing legislation, which is the Standards Act of number 18 of 1997, the Metrology Act number 18 of 2004, and we have our strategies and policies that govern what we do and how we do it and how we relate and be of value to the wider communities within different sectors and within Trinidad and Tobago. So we have our national quality policy and we have our national standardization strategy. The national standardization strategy gives us direction as to which standards will be developed within a particular period of time. And that comes from looking at socioeconomic issues as well as issues which may be highlighted within the period of our review for standards. The minister has said, Minister Honorable Paula Gopi-Schoon, Ministry of Trade and Industry, and that is the ministry to which the TTBS reports. Today's standards continue to play an integral role in both trade and business competitiveness across sectors. And risk management is very important in ensuring that there is business continuance and that businesses remain competitive across sectors. So if we look at the roles and responsibilities of the Trans-Tobago Bureau of Standards, with the national standards body, of course, we're talking about standards today, with the national quality certifying body, with the national laboratory accreditation body, and with the National Measurement Institute. As it relates to standards, I'm sorry. I thought my phone was off. I'm sorry about that. As we talk about standards-related mandate, under our Act, the Bureau shall promote and encourage the development and maintenance of standards and shall further develop standards for the improvement of goods produced. My phone seems to be not turning off. I'm sorry. Let me just do that. Sorry about that. As we move on, standards for the improvement of goods produced for or used in Trinidad and Tobago to ensure industrial efficiency and development, to promote public and industrial welfare, health and safety, and for the protection of the environment. And to do this, we have different levels of standardization in which we participate as a bureau. We participate at the international level, which would be ISO, IC, and to some extent ASTM. We participate in COPANT, which is the regional body for the Americas. And we participate in CARICOM CrossQ, which is a sub-regional level, which is for CARICOM member states. And then, of course, at the national level, where TTBS will follow the standardization process that we have implemented in our quality management system to ensure for the development of standards. And today, as Andia would have pointed out, we're talking about international standards that will be adopted at the national level. So what is a standard? A lot of us know this already, but just to ensure that we're all on the same page where this is concerned, it's a document established by consensus, meaning that there is no sustained opposition to this standard. It's approved by a recognized body, which is the TTBS. We're a recognized body because we have the mandate on the legislation, and that provides for common and repeated use, whether they're rules, guidelines, or characteristics for products, materials, processes, services, and systems. And we have within our portfolio voluntary and compulsory standards. Voluntary standards are generally representative of minimum levels of acceptability, and they're adopted at the discretion of the business. And that's why they are voluntary, because businesses can choose or organizations can choose to adopt or not to adopt. And usually we recommend to organizations that if there's a standard that has been developed within their particular sector, that they do adopt, because that helps to improve the business across the board. It helps in efficiency, reduces waste, for better operations, and so on, depending, of course, exactly on what the standard is. The advantages provided are different, but standards do provide advantages to organizations when they're adopted on a voluntary basis. And so they're compulsory standards, and these standards impact directly on the health and safety of the users, the organizations, or the environment, and they are enforceable by law. And the standards that are enforceable by law under the TTBS enforces. But there are also standards which are considered voluntary standards, but which are enforced under the acts of other agencies. And then they become law, and then they're mandated for the requirements to be followed by the organizations that they affect within a particular sector. So just to give you a little brief synopsis of some of the principles of standardization, this is not all of them, there are quite a few more, but these are the ones I want to highlight today. Transparency. It is essential that information and essential information both regarding standardization activities is accessible to all interested parties. That's why we're here today. It's a part of our transparency process. Openness, participation is open to all affected parties. Again, that's why we're here today. Impartiality, no one interest dominates the process or is favored over another. Again, that's why we're here today, to ensure that all parties can participate and all voices can be heard, even though this is an international standard that we are adopting. And the last one is effectiveness and relevance. Standards are relevant and effectively respond to regulatory and market needs, as well as scientific and technological developments. And Andy would have given us quite a bit of reasons why this standard is relevant at this time and will contribute to market needs. All right. So the standards development process. Number one, the first thing that happens is that there's a need identified, and there are several ways in which needs are identified. One of the major ways in which that is done is through the National Standardization Strategy, where we look at, as I said before, socioeconomic activities, and we look at the major contributors to those activities. But there are other ways. There may be, for example, an issue that has come up in the public domain, which is a pressing issue. For example, a couple of years ago, we had an incident where gates were falling on children and the elderly, and so that prompted us to develop a standard for sliding gates. There may be needs of the government at the time that we may need to address to help in their enforcement within a particular sector or particular area. And so there are different ways in which the need may be identified. But number one is for the need to be identified and for the benefit to be identified as well. And what we do is this standard will be assigned to a standards officer, and they will do their desk research, technical and market research, and prepare the working draft for the standard. And that would be number 3. Number 4 is the convening of a specification committee. So we will ask persons, organizations, experts from a sector to become a part of the specification committee that is going to finalize the requirements, finalize the guidelines, the rules within the standard, and ensure that the standard meets the need for which it is being developed as far as is possible within the committee. And the specification committee usually consists of importers, if it's a product, importers, distributors, academia, NGOs, consumer liaison groups, business support groups. So we try as best as possible to get a wide audience as we can, and then to have members of those organizations be represented on the specification committee to move the working draft through to a committee draft and then to a public comment draft, which takes us to number 5, where we actually are right now. So number 5, the 5th step in the process would be to have the standard widely available publicly for review and comment by anybody who is interested in the particular standard. And so having the stakeholder consultation is a part of that process in ensuring that the information gets out there to the public and everybody has access to the document on our website and can comment on the document. And it doesn't matter if the document is an internationally produced standard, a regionally produced standard, or a nationally produced standard. All standards that are going to become national standards have to be accessible to the public for everyone to be able to comment on it, discuss it at the organizational level or whether at a personal level, and give us feedback on the document. All right. After that happens, we move on to stage number 6, which is the resolution of comments. So all comments that we receive from the public, from institutions and organizations, all of those comments go back to the specification committee for address. And when the comments are all addressed, then we complete the draft standard and it goes to stage number 7, which is the technical and marketing committee of the TTBS, which is a subset of our board. They view the standard from a technical point of view mostly, and they give us feedback on the standard, and then they approve or don't approve the standard to go forward to the TTBS board. And then the TTBS board will declare or not declare the standard to be a national standard. If there are objections to the standard, whatever those particular objections are, they either come back to the TTBS, and then the TTBS goes to the specification committee. Sometimes it's just an issue that the TTBS needs to address, so it will be addressed in-house at the standardization division, or it goes to the specification committee to address, and then we go back through that those steps again back to the technical and marketing committee and then back to the board. And after that, the standard is published as a national standard. However, there are further steps. And the reason those steps are not included here is because we do not, as TTBS, have control over those steps. And those are the legal obligation steps. Because for a standard to be made a national standard, there are legal obligations. There's a legal process that the standards have to go through. And that requires a standard going to the CPC and being gazetted in the government gazette. We do what is called a declaration of compulsory standard, if it's a compulsory standard. If it's a compulsory standard, it also needs to go through the Ministry of Trade, through the minister. If it's voluntary, that step is not there. And the standard just gets gazetted in the National Trinidad and Tobago Gazette. All right. So those are the steps for the development of a standard. Now, Henry Ford said, if you think of standardization as the best that you know today, but which is to be improved tomorrow, you get somewhere. And basically, what he's saying is that we do the best that we can with the information that we have today when we're doing standards. When the TTBS started back in 1970s, there was no AI, and there were no computers. So it is within our best interest to always have a review of our standards, which we do every 5 years to ensure that the standards are up to date. However, if there are new developments within that field, then sometimes those standards get reviewed earlier than the 5 years. If there are no developments, sometimes they may get reviewed later than the 5 years, but we keep a consistent 5 years to go back, check on the requirements of the standard, look at what's happening in the environment, and I mean the environment of the sector in which the standard was developed, to ensure that the standard is still current, still relevant to the subject matter under standardization. So this is where you come in, the stakeholder. Stakeholders can either be members of our specification committee. Stakeholders can give us questions on the particular area that is being standardized, offer comments, or offer suggestions. So this particular stakeholder consultation is being held to get comments back from stakeholders, from you, to help us improve the standard that Andy going to be speaking to you about in a few minutes, which has to do with risk management. But the role of the stakeholder is very important in this process, because we want to ensure that the standard always meets the needs of the stakeholders and that stakeholders across the board. So we encourage you to please send us your comments, send us your questions on the standard. They will be addressed because, as I said, stage 6 is where all the comments, suggestions, feedback goes back to the technical committee for review and for any changes that may be necessary. Don't think that because, it's an ISO standard, everything has been done. There's always room for improvement in the standardization process. So I thank you very much, and I hope that helped you to not only understand the role of the TTBS, but most importantly, to also understand your role in the process. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adrian, for sharing the details on the standards development process. And as Adrian mentioned, the standard for these 2 national standards for risk management are at public comment stage. So it's an ideal opportunity for you to send in your comments, review the drafts, and tell us how it can be improved to meet our local context. I do also want to emphasize that these standards will be issued with a voluntary status. Apologies. So it's voluntary for businesses to use at their discretion, but it is a good source of best practices when it comes to risk management. Okay. All right, so now just shifting gears, we'll start to focus our discussions on the two draft standards that we have currently out for public comment. So just let me share my screen. Okay, so let's talk about risk. On your screen, you'll be seeing a link for Slido. You can either enter the Slido link using by scanning the QR code or going to slido.com and entering the code below, which is number 1357146, and share your thoughts on the question. What types of risk does your organization consider? And you can enter more than one answer at a time. Okay, so we see operational risk and financial risk are showing up as major risk considerations for our participants today. We also look at things such as quality, reputation, and that's becoming more and more important, especially in the advent of social media, where we have influences that can either affect the brand's reputation, both positive and negative. We look at occupational health and safety. Yes, that's showing up quite a bit. We have competition, and yes, health and safety is showing up quite a bit, operational and financial. Okay, so what we can see from this simple question, there are a lot of risks that could affect the business operations spanning a variety of topics, and they can have significant or lower level impacts on the organization. So let's look at another question as we're starting our conversations on risk. Similar to the same one, you can either scan the QR code or enter the code in slido.com. But we've talked about the risk our organization considers, but how do you communicate those risks with external stakeholders? So many persons say in meetings. Are these meetings virtual or face to face? And we have some quality persons here who have specified documented communications. Mm, okay, so we have some other answers coming in. So social media, through policies, the risk register, HSC meetings, virtual, public consultation meetings. So what we're seeing then is a mixture of predominantly we're having meeting face to face or in some form with the external stakeholder. And we also have where we're engaging them through social media, blogs, and emails. So there's a way to track the information that was shared with these external stakeholders. So, as we said earlier in the first one, businesses are exposed to many different types of risk, and how we communicate these risks comes in various forms, and there are various factors to be considered with it. And these are some of the topics that come up in our national standards for risk management. Mm. So before I go into the overview of our national standards, just to give some ideas of today's stakeholder objectives. Today, we're aiming at raising awareness on the draft standards that have been issued for public comment and to encourage you to submit your feedback and review of the draft standards. It's important to note that this isn't a full webinar or information session on the standards because we're really looking to introduce the key concepts of the draft documents to solicit your feedback on it. Once the standards have been published, and if there are sufficient interest, we can then go into looking into training and information sessions on details of the full document. So once we're clear and have that common understanding of the standards, I can start with let's looking at TTS ISO 31000 risk management guidelines. As we mentioned, this is our national adoption of the international standard ISO 31000 2018. On this slide, you'll see 202X because it means the X will be the year that it's published, and we're aiming to have it published and approved by the end of this year. So let's talk about TTS ISO 31000, which deals with guidelines for risk management. The scope of the document, this document provides guidelines on managing risk faced by organization. The application of these guidelines can be customized to any organization and its context. It provides a common approach to managing risk and is not sector specific. The document can be used throughout the life of the organization and can be applied to any organization of size or type. So the draft standard is based on three pillars. What we have here, the principles, framework, and process. So our principles here, the first slide looks at value creation and protection, and it identifies the characteristics of a risk management process that is aimed at creating an efficient process that protects the value of your organization that it has created. The framework looks at how we implement these principles, and the process looks at the policies and strategies and documents that we use to help enable and enact what we have envisioned in our risk management process. So let's talk about principles a bit more. So as I mentioned, these are the characteristics of your risk management process that ensures that it is efficient and effective in addressing and mitigating the risk that you have identified. Now, you're going to see these with some words coming up throughout the document. Integrated. And one of the characteristics of your risk management process is that it should be integrated or a part of all your organizational activities. Risk management and risk-based thinking needs to happen throughout your entire value stream process, and it's not something that should be regulated to, say, one specific department. For example, if you were a shipping company, and your focus was on ensuring that your packages are delivered on time, and you just look at risk managing in terms of delivery. So you look at weather patterns, transport, and things like that that affect the delivery time. That's great, and that it achieves one sector of it. But if you become blind to other impacts onto your process, for example, if countries start to look at enacting laws that require shipping packages to be biodegradable, it means that you would have been missing that horizon scanning or possible risk that can have significant impacts on your operations. So that's why we say it's not a one department or a one person thing, but risk thinking and risk-based decision making needs to happen at all levels of the organization and throughout its value stream. Also thinking about it, customized. The risk management framework and process are customized and proportionate to the organization's external and internal context. It's important to ensure that whatever risk treatment that we identify in our plan, it's proportionate to the level of impact that it can have on a company, as well as the size and nature of the company. So, for example, the classic example in health and safety is the issue of the paper cut in the office. So, yes, a paper cut can be considered an injury, but how much in terms of proportion can you put into preventing a paper cut, and what is the impact it can have on employees? So it's important that we ensure whatever process or risk treatment we implement, it meets the needs of the specific organization and is proportionate to the risk level and the operations of the company. Now, turning into some of the factors that affect risk, it's important to understand risk can emerge, change, and disappear. That's why we have to look at constant horizon scanning to see what is going on and making sure our risk management process is iterative and responsive to the needs. An important part in looking at risk management is ensuring best available information. Now, information can take into account current information, historical information, and future expectations. And this information itself can have limitations as well as can have certain errors or uncertainty with it. For example, future expectations or historical information can have biases or, as we'll learn in the next standard, systemic risk issues. So it's important to understand there are limitations with the information we have and to be able to account for that in our risk treatment process. And lastly, and in terms of what I'm going to highlight in terms of the principles for risk management, is continual improvement. Now, this part persons might normally forget when thinking of risk management, but risk management is continually improved through learning and response. It means then as we go through a risk and treat with the risk and mitigate it, we learn from it and implement those learnings into future risk treatment plans. It's not a one cycle issue, but something that we continuously improve and learn upon. So that way we have a better understanding of how the organization can respond and treat with future risk. So coming back to the pillars, we've looked at principles. Now we're going to shift gears to look at framework. And you can see here on the screen, leadership and commitment. Hold on, let me put on my professor cap and use the laser pointer. So leadership and commitment is what we see as the focal point in establishing and creating a framework for risk management. And that's largely because leadership and commitment represents governance and the incorporation of risk-based thinking into the governance and policy development of risk management processes and the strategic direction of the company is seen as one of the key success factors in having a sound and robust risk management system. And that's why leadership and commitment is seen as the central and focus point for creating that framework. Beyond there, you see the main components of design, implementation, evaluation, improvement, and integration. And we have that word integration showing up again. If you're a quality person, you might start to see similarities between this framework and the plan, do, check, act cycle, where designing your system correlates with planning, implementation, do, evaluation, check, and improvement, act. And there's also, again, the high level importance of integration, ensuring that risk-based thinking shows up at all levels in decision making and across the entire value stream of the company's operations. In particular, leadership, where we referred to them as top management, should ensure that risk management is integrated. Integrated shows up again into all organizational activities and should demonstrate leadership and commitment by one, customizing and implementing components of the framework. And it's important when we say customize, because the standard gives you the guidelines for you to follow and the best practice. But it's important to understand risk management is not a one size fit all. So it's important to understand the scope and context of your organization's operations and then tailor the best practices provided in the standard to how your company operates. We also look at issuing a statement or policy to establish a risk management approach or plan. And this is important because it takes risk management from being a concept, this of, say, having corridor talks, saying, yes, we really do need to consider risk, to where we have a documented process and it becomes concrete and actionable activities. Very important is to ensure that necessary resources are allocated to managing risk and assigning authority, responsibility, and accountability at appropriate levels within the organization. And the last pillar, and I've pulled it out big so everyone can see because there's a bit lot going on into this pillar here, where we talk about the process for risk management. So firstly, we start with scope, context, and criteria. And this is where the standard goes through and provides guidelines on how do you determine the context of the organization, what are your internal and external influence factors, what risk criteria can be used to determine what will affect your organization. So this first part is where we look at understanding the organization itself. Then we go into risk assessment, which is broken up into a process itself of identifying the risk, analyzing the risk, and then evaluating it. Once we have that risk assessment completed, we then go into what we call the risk treatment, where you develop your action plan to mitigate or, in some cases, ignore the risk that has been presented. Now, you also do have some influencing factors in your risk assessment, communication, and consultation. So it's important to note in the standard, there's a difference between communication and consultation. Communication is where you share information, and consultation is where you invite feedback and incorporate feedback into whatever process is being developed. And it's important that there's always that avenue to provide that feedback, to hear from your internal and external stakeholders. So it's inclusive and allows for a better understanding of how the risk can affect both your known and unknown factors, internal and external stakeholders. And the monitoring and review part of it also looks to see how well are we mitigating the risk? And it can be dynamic. So if we note the process that we use to mitigate the risk is not achieving our intended result, we can adapt it as needed be. And because we're monitoring and reviewing our implementation plan, we can adjust it as quickly as needed if we recognize there's a problem with it. And of course, recording and reporting. We want to ensure that whatever lessons we learned or whatever has happened throughout this risk treatment process, it's recorded and reported so that we can treat with the plan as necessary for future needs and tweak where it needs to be tweaked. To give some details on the risk assessment, as I mentioned, it looks at three main issues. Risk identification. This is where we look to find, recognize, and describe the risk, understand what the risks are, and that might help or prevent an organization from achieving its objectives. And some issues or factors to consider. Now, the standard does give a detailed listing, but I've just pulled out some to highlight for this session. We look at time-related factors. Does it affect our on-time delivery? Is it going to give us a longer lead time and where we have more time to address the risk that has been identified? Limitations of knowledge. If it's something new, how do we achieve mitigating the risk if we have limited knowledge on it? Limited knowledge as well as the reliability of information. And of course, biases and assumptions, which is not something we might normally think of when we're looking at risk identification, but our biases and assumptions can sort of deter or dampen how significant the risk is or how not significant the risk is. Once we've identified the risk, we look to comprehend the nature of the risk and its characteristics, including the level of risk. Some factors to consider is how likelihood it's about to happen? How probable is it? Something that we think it's 100% likely to happen, or something that's most likely not going to happen, but to still have on our radar? Important is its complexity and connectivity. Some risk can have an avalanche effect and throw on to other risk, and that um, unknown combination itself can create another risk. So it's important when we're analyzing the risk that we look at its complexity and connectivity with our operations or operations from other companies that can affect us, and sensitivity and confidence. And we talked a little bit about that when we are talking about how to communicate about risk. In an era where we have social media and viral videos, how then do we assess our confidence or sensitive information is shared with external stakeholders, or how then does that affect our brand integrity? And lastly, under the risk assessment bubble, we have risk evaluation. And this is where it's done to support our decision making, and how then do we respond to the risk we have identified. Risk evaluation involves comparing the results of the risk analysis with established risk criteria to determine where additional action is required. And our risk evaluation can lead to decisions to, one, do nothing further because we think it's well contained; two, consider risk treatment options; three, undertake further analysis if we think there's limited information and it's something that we need to keep on track; maintain existing controls; or three, reconsider objectives. And it's important to understand if something is so radical that it can drastically affect our objectives, do we need to retail our objectives until that risk can be addressed by the company, national scale or global scale, based on the impact and level of the risk? And I did want to highlight, we do have details on creating risk treatment plans and operations, but for the purposes of this webinar and time, I've just focused on risk assessment, but they are available in the draft documents for your review. And then just coming back to communication, because it's something that persons normally not think about when we look at risk. Remember some of the aims of communication. It's to bring together different areas of expertise and should happen at each stage in the risk management process. And what it does is build a sense of inclusiveness and ownership among those affected by the risk. What the standard would explain is stakeholders are persons who are affected or perceive themselves to be affected by the operation. So it's important as part of our communication process, we understand that communicating about the risk also looks at communicating about the risk of perception, whether they be grounded in reality or not, but you're addressing those perceptions that persons may have. And some factors to consider when communicating is, who are you communicating to, and what message is being communicated, and the communication channels. It's important you understand the audience so we can tailor our message to meet those persons and have them understand the message that's being conveyed. Because sometimes it's very important if, for example, persons are living close to an industrial facility and they hear warning bells, they need to know the process for evacuating. So it's important that it's easy to understand and the communication channels is appropriate for your specific target audience. And again, as is coming up throughout the standard, it's the issue of sensitivity on confidentiality. It's important to understand who your target audience is and what information will be shared to that target audience in terms of its level of confidential information, or if it's something for broad dissemination to many stakeholders. So these are some of the factors to be considered when communicating about risk with both internal and external stakeholders. And just to bring it home on the monitoring and review, the purpose of monitoring and review is to assure and improve the quality and effectiveness of our risk management process, design, implementation, and of course the outcomes, because we want to ensure whatever we put in place ultimately benefits the organization and the organization's response. And this can only happen from continuous learning. So once we learn, okay, it didn't work this time, but this worked last time, we pool those lessons learned to create a better outcome for future risk. Ongoing monitoring and review of the risk management process should take place at all stages in the process and includes planning, gathering, analyzing information, recording results, and providing feedback. The results of the monitoring and review should be incorporated throughout the organization's performance management, measurement, and reporting activities. Okay, so these are some of the key concepts from TTS ISO 21000 for risk management guidelines. I'll put it in the chat box, but this is the link on your screen right now where the draft documents are available for review, and you can also submit your feedback on them. So we do have a Q&A session at the end, but if any person has any comments or questions, you can feel free to add it in the chat and we will address it when we come to the Q&A session. Oh, sorry, I was muted there. So let's move our conversations now into the next standard, which looks at emerging risk. So you have on your screen a Slido. So let us know what are some of the major emerging risks which may impact your business. You can rank using the options on your screen right now.
Hi, that number doesn't show as an active poll. Do you need to start the poll? Thanks.
Okay, sure. Let me see what's going on with it then. And 1 second, let me stop share and just go to Slido to see what happened.
Okay, it's active now. Thanks.
Please note you're muted.
Yes, apparently this is my risk for today. Okay, so I see cybersecurity is one of the major issues that's been as that company participants are identifying as an emerging risk. So let me ask, when did you start to notice cybersecurity as an emerging risk? Was it through scanning your horizon, or was it when we noticed many of the data breaches that has been happening in Trinidad of late? Okay, so Devendra, I see you have 1996. Is that a specific year when when you learned about started to notice that cybersecurity has some issues? Okay, yes, you saw when you first went onto the internet. Very good. It is true because the internet did bring it with itself some risk to follow with it in terms of confidentiality and security of information. Okay, so let me just be able to change this slide. Okay, so we do have a little problem right now with the screen, so let me stop share and come back to this PowerPoint. Okay. Okay, great. So our second standard on risk management looks at the adoption of ISO TS 31050 for risk management guidelines for managing emerging risk to enhance resilience. So for this session, we're going to shake things up a little bit. What I'll do is lay the groundwork for some of the key concepts provided in this standard, and then we'll have some committee members joining in to as a sort of panel discussion to share some information on the standards itself. So going back to laying the groundwork for it, the scope of this standard gives guidance on managing emerging risk that an organization can face. It complements ISO 31000. So it's meant to be working in partnership with 31000 and take some of the principles and framework and process and tailors it specifically on how to address emerging risk. This document, like the previous standard, is applicable to any organization at any stage and to any activity of the organization. This application can be customized to suit different organizations or the context of different organizations. So some of the key concepts introduced in the standard are: one, radical innovation. And the standard identifies radical innovation as innovation with a high degree of change. Disruptive innovation, innovation initially addressing less demanding needs, displacing established offerings. So it's to understand how radical innovation and disruptive innovation can coexist. The best example I can give for radical innovation was when the iPad was first introduced, or the personal computer. That radically changed how businesses and persons operated and communicated with each other. Disruptive innovation, as it's more of an incremental phase and it's not so much different from what is established and already existing, can be considered when we have every year a new phone model is coming out. It's not drastically different. It has small updates which persons can use. So it's a good way to recognize the difference between radical innovation and disruptive innovation. Also important to understand when looking at emerging risk is the concept of intelligence. Intelligence is a result of gathering, analyzing, and interpreting data, information, and knowledge. And as we learned from the previous standard, our information can also have its limitations, and it's based on historical, current, and future expectations. So it's important to understand, especially for emerging risk, our intelligence can be well rooted in historical past events, but can also have some biases or limitations based on the information that is available, as well as be able to react as information becomes more changing as we learn more about the emerging risk that has been developed. And also looking at is the nature of emerging risk. So these emerging risks can be known risks that we're already familiar with, familiar risk in new or unfamiliar contexts. So it might be something that we were looking at for one operation, but now it's rippling into another operation. So it gives us some sort of familiarity with how the risk behaves, but also it brings in some uncertainty as we don't know how it behaves in this new context. There's the issue of systemic risk, and there is quite a large section on systemic risk within the standard. And lastly, the novel combination of risk. So sometimes we can have individual risk that we are well known of, but their novel combination can have severe impacts on the operations of the company. So, for example, coming back to the courier company that looks at delivering items, it might be welcome looking at the in terms of delivering its products, we might be considering climate change. And climate change can affect its delivery time in that we have new severe weather patterns, but there also might be new considerations in terms of packaging. Should it be biodegradable? And then also disposal of packaging as it's become more and more in Europe, certain products aren't getting as much consumer buy-in because there are more restrictions on disposing certain types of packages. Further to that, we look at the characterization of emerging risk. What do we know about the risk? How volatile it is? What level of uncertainty do we have with it? How complex it is? How ambiguous it is in terms of our operations and the information we have available on it, and the time dimension. And that is it something that we can spend some more time to analyze, or is it going to immediately affect our operations? We can look at COVID-19 when we had the lockdowns. We often had limited time notice for when lockdowns would occur. So how then do you design your operations that can where there's a time dimension that can affect it rapidly or not rapidly. And that's something to look at when we have emerging risk. And of course, controllability. Can we control it, or what measures needs to be put in place to mitigate it as much as possible until we get more information about that risk? So these are the key concepts and groundwork for TTS ISO 31050, which looks at emerging risk. So now I'm going to invite some of our committee members to join in on the conversation to give some more information on risk management with a particular focus on emerging risk. Today we have Mr. Shazam Idu. who has 2 decades of professional experience encompassing a diverse range of disciplines, including quality assurance, environmental management, health and safety, crisis communication, and enterprise risk management. His career spans various industries, including power generation, petrochemicals, construction, manufacturing, and port and marine terminal operations. In his dedication to his profession, Mr. Idu generously volunteers his time as a mentor at the Institution of Occupational Safety and Health. Furthermore, he serves as the chair of the IOSH Caribbean branch and plays a pivotal role in the National Technical Committee for Occupational Safety and Health. He is the chair of that committee and has been doing quite a fine job at it. So please welcome Mr. Shazam Idu. And we are also joined by Mr. Devendra Chattergoon. Devendra has been involved in developing standards for over 20 years. His formal knowledge of risk spans general risk management, quality, health and safety, and finance. As a technical expert to ISO, the International Organization for Standardization, he helped develop, inter alia, several international standards, including IWA 31-2020, risk management, guidelines on using ISO 31000 in management systems. Devendra volunteers as a member of the TTBS National Mirror Committees and Technical Committees to ISO for Occupational Health and Safety and Innovation Management. He also serves as a chair for the Quality Management Systems National Mirror Committee. At the ISO level, he's a technical expert to ISO TC 176, and this is the committee which looks at developing ISO 9001 quality management systems. So welcome Shazam and Devendra to our panel discussion where we talk a little bit about ISO 31050 risk management for emerging risk. So feel free to turn on your cameras and join us.
Hi.
So,
Okay, so I also resemble the picture you have of me. That's fine for now. Thanks.
No problem. So, Shazam, we turn it over to you. How does managing emerging risk contribute to building organizational resilience?
So in the context, I think you did a good introduction as to the standard itself, where it is at now, and why we are going to pursue this for Trinidad and Tobago. And traditionally, risk management focuses on supporting an organization to achieve its actual objectives and plans. Tackling emerging risks is a little bit different. It kind of helps the organization to build its resilience or maintain resilience to ensure that we'll survive and through bad times thrive in uncertain times, obviously. Right. So if we look at a different step back and we go back a little bit, it will actually help to anticipate adverse situations or scenarios and prepare the organization to withstand or absorb those impacts, right? And possibly, obviously, at the same time, recover from the effects and adapt to changing conditions. It also allows them to respond and adapt to opportunities to take prompt action and informed decisions, right? So if I'm not sure if persons are familiar with the foresight model by Cranfield, right? Cranfield University and the researchers over there, which they speak to the foresight model, which is foresight, insight, oversight, and hindsight, which kind of links back to organizational resilience. And if you look at foresight being anticipation, prediction, and preparation for your future, insight could be these things, obviously, interpreting and responding to any scenarios that you have or conditions that you have. You have the oversight, which is more or less like monitoring and reviewing, and you have hindsight, obviously learning from those things after the fact. So it's similar to the PDCA, if you realize, and it carries the same format, but it's in a different way, which we look at it from organizational resilience. Building that resilience for these organizations so they can better be able to withstand any unfortunate circumstances or disruptions, and obviously get them back on their feet in a quick time, right? It also helps leaders to kind of prioritize and build in resilience efforts that they want to do in the company itself. So it really is a supporting 31050 is a supporting document that most companies may already be using 31000, some form of it or piece of it, it kind of supports that in a certain way to really bring that resilience part all together and make the company much more prepared for those things. And if we look at it from a different point as well, there's also the proactive side of resilience and the reactive side of resilience. Many of us are doing the proactive, I'm sure. The enterprise risk management systems, HSC management, planning and coordination, communication, liaison, types of the things that you would do before, horizon scanning, training of employees, monitoring, measuring. All these are part of the proactive side and even continuous improvement, which you spoke about earlier. On the reactive side, now we have the incident response, the crisis management, the business continuity, and the recovery activities after something happens or occurs. We go into that response mode and recovery after any back end. So it's actually, from that perspective, it's going to be helping the organization to build that level of resilience. And the emerging risks, having identified those emerging risks, will also make the company better at what they do in terms of the services and goods. Yeah.
Thank you, Shazab. And I think coming out of COVID-19, a lot of organizations are paying more attention to emerging risk, both at the national scale and the global scale.
That's right.
Okay. And Devendra, now turning it over to you. So TD150 talks a lot about the risk intelligence cycle. Can you tell us about the risk intelligence cycle and how it contributes to managing emerging risk? So I do have a picture of the cycle up, so I can share the screen as needed.
Okay, good. So thanks. Good. So we start with the definition of intelligence. And for those that may be familiar with data information, knowledge, perhaps persons that may be familiar with ISO 9001, 7.1.6, and that standard talks about organizational knowledge. Intelligence really is one step beyond that, because as we see on the screen, intelligence within ISO 3150, 31050, is the result of gathering, analyzing, and interpreting data, information, and knowledge. And it's only when you look at these different aspects that you get intelligence as the output or the result. And the note to the entry makes it clear that we need to look at different kinds of intelligence depending on what could be emerging in terms of risk. All right. So certainly in terms of the question that right. So in terms of the risk intelligence cycle, we can look then at the diagram. Not that one, the next one. Great, thanks. Okay, so if it's a little blurry, that's all right, just magnify your screen. Just kidding, I will go through what's on the left, first of all, and that comes out of the ISO 31000 standard, which talks about your risk assessment, identification, analysis, evaluation, then leading to risk treatment. That is supported in the ISO 31050 by the risk intelligence cycle, which is to the right on your screen. And one of the critical things we need to recognize about emerging risk is that they may not be clearly identified, they may not be clearly defined. We don't have, in many instances, much or adequate information about the particular risk. I mean, us having this webinar online is, to me, a direct result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And in one of the very early conferences that was held on COVID-19, one of the recognized experts said it's not going to be much worse than a difficult cold. And that is not to say that the person is not an expert, but it says that at the early stages, even experts may not correctly identify the nature, the characteristics, and the potential effects of a risk. So starting off on that risk intelligence cycle, we're looking at asking that first question at the top. Do we have suitable quantity and quality of raw data or information about context? If the answer is no, well, then we go around the outer oval where those nice white arrows are. If we do think that we have gathered enough information and data from scanning the environment, and the answer then becomes yes, we move into the white oval and we then frame what we're going to assess. And framing, the stage of framing is where we would look at having an outcome where the criteria and the scope of the context or the intelligence generation is clearly defined. So it's really about putting some boundaries around what is it we need to look at, what is it we need to consider for this particular emerging risk. All right. And as Andy would have alluded to in a previous slide, one of the very dangerous things about risks is the connectivity or the interaction between risks. Yes, you may be afraid of heights. Walking on the ground or going up on the first floor of a building isn't too difficult. But if we put you up on the 82nd floor of a building and tell you there's a 6-inch wide plank and we want you to walk across to the top of another building at the same level, that's a combination of risks, and certainly we don't recommend that to anyone. So when we look at gathering the information, we need to be very clear what is the risk we're looking at as opposed to other risks which do exist in the environment. So moving on from framing, we go to data gathering and analysis. Remember, we're at the very early stages. We're gathering the data and information, which then will become knowledge that is then analyzed to become intelligence. So we're still very early in the process. So data gathering and analysis allows us to, within the boundaries we have defined in the framing, to go out and collect the data and start putting it in some meaningful manner. For those of you that are into IT or maybe into knowledge management, otherwise, data we usually talk about as raw data or facts that are disorganized or disconnected. And when we do some basic analysis, that's when it becomes meaningful, and we use the term information. So the outcome of that second stage on the right of your white oval, data gathering and analysis, the outcome is to generate information, which is then interpreted. It goes to the next stage, which is interpretation. And the outcome of that is knowledge. As you see in the brackets there, it's interpreted information, which then allows decision makers to come to some type of a decision relating to the intelligence once that knowledge has been communicated. So we're moving to the left of the oval, continuing with our arrows, and we see that intelligence, the outcome there would be that communicated knowledge, and you can then apply, once we go to the diamond in blue with the white writing. The white writing says suitable quality of knowledge, question mark. If the quality of knowledge is suitable for decision makers, the answer is yes. Then we apply the knowledge, and that goes across into the risk analysis and risk evaluation. If the answer is no, then we continue gathering data, we continue scanning, we continue interpretation. In some cases, we may need to reframe. So you would see a double-headed arrow vertically between framing and interpretation. So the diagram at first glance is quite complex because there are arrows all over the place, left, right, up and down, going around in a circle, and so on. But I hope that the explanation has helped you to appreciate in some measure the cycle that's involved with risk intelligence and how we go about managing the emerging risk, how it's connected. How the risk intelligence cycle is connected to managing risk in the way that we would normally do, whether through the framework of ISO 31000 or otherwise through general risk management principles. So, and they are hoping that I have been able to add some clarity rather than more confusion. I thank you and return the floor to you.
Thank you, Devendra. You certainly have added some more clarity. And for our participants' information, the risk intelligence cycle is detailed in clause 8 of ISO 31050. So you can also refer to that specific clause for more information on how it talks about applying the risk intelligence cycle to managing emerging risk at the organizational level. Okay, and last question I have both for Shazam and Devendra. So it seems that managing risk can be complicated, but emerging risk can affect any organization size or type, from your pizza parlor to your oil drilling companies. So can TTS ISO TS 31050 be used by any organization?
Okay, I'll start. I think, of course, it can. I think it can be used for both maybe major high risk, major hazard facilities to the small mom and pop shops. In the context, I guess, is based upon the context, the criteria, and the scope, which you mentioned earlier on as well. Understanding those parameters are important in terms of determining how far you go, how in depth you go when it comes to risk management and understanding the risk profiles of the organization. While both of them are voluntary and you cannot be certified to them, I think it's good guidance to support your other management systems, which kind of hinge on 31000 as being the go-to standard for risk-based thinking, risk management, and 31050. This even further supports that now with the new part of emerging risk and building that support from the back end, or having persons now think about not just the ones that are in front of you or maybe ones that are foreseeable, but the ones that are not right in front of your face. And you have to do the homework, because the risk intelligence, which Devendra spoke about just now, is a key part of getting that information in, understanding the data, analyzing it, and continuously going through it with different stakeholders internally, externally. I think other parts of it are it's ready to break down the silos of companies, because we understand that risk has to be integrated into your strategy, and it's through the organization has to participate in that process for it to be successful. So in order to be resilient, and the use of that 31050 to build that is important. Having that as part of the company's agenda throughout all different avenues, projects, different aspects of the business. I think there is a key to go through and follow through on.
Thank you. And I think it's important, no matter the size of the organization, because you ultimately want to be able to grow your business, and risk and emerging risk can affect you at any stage. So it's important to be able to develop the skills on how to address it and be looking for those emerging risks. Devendra, anything to add in terms of, can these standards be used for any type of organization, size, or functions?
Yes, sure. So certainly to agree with our Chairman Shazam, it can be used by any organization. It says in the scope section 1 of the standard, this document is applicable to any organization at any stage. and to any activity of the organization. However, I'd like to let our participants know that as per the ISO IEC directives, standards are written for qualified persons who were not involved in developing the standard to be able to apply or use the standard. So it's not the case that persons without some type of background or training in risk management can read ISO 31050 and apply it, or indeed any of the other ISO standards. It requires some knowledge in the field. And if we're looking at the average doubles man, looking at going to a new location to set up and considering the risks, if I get there in the morning before the sun rises, it's a fairly dark area, given the high crime in society and doublesmen being a relatively easy target, what's the risk that I will be robbed? You know, and a doublesman sure can make that type of basic assessment. But when we start getting into the complexities of business to business relationships, and you start looking at risks related to competitors, risks introduced by legislation, for example, the Office of Procurement Regulation, last year in particular, there was a strong drive to have companies doing business with the government registered. That in itself produced some level of risk that was characterized as emerging risk, because the companies, of course, weren't very clear on the process, and unfortunately, from feedback I've heard from multiple sources, at the very early days, neither were the persons that were supposed to be helping the companies register. So when we consider categorizing these emerging risks and doing the analysis, it does require some level of background or training or knowledge in risk management to be able to apply the standard. So yes, it can be used by any organization, but just to let our participants know, ISO itself uses technical experts from around the world to write these standards for persons that have some level of knowledge or ability in the particular field. So I think that's a good addition, because Shazam, of course, answered the question, and there's very little I could have added. Thanks, back to you. All right, you're muted.
You know, it's my mouse is giving some trouble today, so I'm unmuted now. Okay, so thank you, Devendra, and thank you for providing that clarity on it, especially when we talk about being able to customize the requirements of the standard to organizations. You do want to ensure that you have someone who can give the appropriate guidance on it, and it's something that's coming up more and more in the management systems standards in general, to ensure that whatever is designed is something that is done that suits the needs of the company. Okay, so I think that's the little short questions we have on ISO TS 31050. As we said, we just want to introduce the key concepts in these two national standards to raise awareness on them and to encourage your feedback. So at this time, we'll also remind you that the status can be accessed using the link on your screen below, and I can add it in the chat after, as well as send it via email for you. So now you've heard a lot of us speaking. We want to hear from you, the participants. The floor is yours. Any questions or comments that you may have had on the two standards, please feel free to share. Oh, yes, we have a hand. Betty, please go ahead.
Hi. Thanks for the invite. I am thinking that ISO 31000 and 50 is a stress is on utilizing the results of a pestle or stipple. You know, usually when we prepare a strategic plan, we might do a SWOT, and that looks at the microenvironment. But I think 31,050 is saying you need to pay attention to that macro environment. And that's where the pistol or the stipple, whatever you want to call it, comes in. Does any of your panelists agree with this?
If I'd like to jump in there, I think you're 100% correct. PESTLE, SWOT for internal and external environments are key because they are both strategic tools, and horizon scanning as a key one as well are the tools you would want to be using for identifying those emerging risks. Yeah, quite spot on.
Thanks.
All right, Devendra here. To add to that, while those are very common and well-known management tools, again, to go back to the COVID experience, when you get into full risk management, the experts in risk identify things like pandemics and viruses and so on, which may not have previously, I mean, when these things became popularized between the 70s, 80s, into 90s, those techniques, people tended to focus on, just the areas covered by the acronyms. If you're SWOT, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. PESTLE, you're looking at political, economic, social, legal or legislative, and environmental. So in the more advanced analyses or the expanded descriptions, sure, we can have things like viruses and pandemics put under threats or even under environment beyond the green environment or the natural environment. We can look into viruses, illnesses, and so on. But when we expand our risk criteria, we can consider things like, we see in the movies sometimes an asteroid heading to Earth, a satellite losing orbit capability and falling to the ground somewhere in a populated city. So there are many other types of risks that when, as Shazam mentioned, you're talking about horizon scanning, you use multiple horizons rather than working within the sort of standard framework. But those are certainly excellent starting points. But if people had stuck to those religiously, then they wouldn't have been well prepared at the early days for COVID-19, for example. Thanks.
Thank you. I did want to share one part of the standard that looks at factors that can influence the emerging risk. So let me just share screen. Okay. Let me know if it's large enough for the participants to see.
Yes, it is.
Okay, great. So it's important to understand some of the areas that the standard goes into in understanding the emerging risk. So Annex D, which is informative, gives examples of factors that could influence managing it. So building on what Devendra mentioned, so there are things like misperception and misinterpretation, global catastrophic potential, which we've learned from COVID-19, miscommunication, which is coming more and more prevalent in risk management, especially given how widespread it can become with social media. There are things like single person level of perception, and talks about trust, identity of affected persons. And also we go into related to governance of the emerging risk, protection and precaution, social unrest, and then related to the global management of emerging risk where it happens, for example. So hopefully this can give some information, building on what we said, where we have the PESTLE and the SWOT, the management tools, as well as other examples of factors that can influence what to consider when you're managing your emerging risk. Okay, any other questions from participants?
Hi, good morning. I'm so sorry. I only joined the call maybe like 5 minutes ago, so I missed the majority of it. So if the questions I'm going to ask may have already been answered, and I did not get the opportunity either to go through the proposal. So my first question is, with this model, is it focused on business risk or safety risk?
So it applies to any type of risk. So it's open, it's up to the organization when they're designing it. So we give you the best practices and principles to use, and any organization can modify it to see based on whichever risk it's looking at, but it's generic and then can be customized by the various organizations.
All right. My next question is, when this becomes a standard, will it be mandatory or voluntary for organizations to implement?
So these standards will be issued as voluntary. It's important to note they are guidelines, so it's not requirements. So like, for example, if you use ISO 45001, which provides requirements, you might see the word shall. These are guidelines, so it uses the word should and gives you recommendations. Because of that, you cannot be certified to the 31,000. But if you already have an existing management system, be it quality or 45,001, for example, and you want to say that you're using the elements of 31,000 in managing your risk, then you can have internal auditors and external auditors look at how well you're comparing to the results of to the recommendations of the standard. Sorry.
Okay. Next question. So how soon will the standard be published?
So our public comment period ends on the 30th of September, after which we'll submit it to our board of directors for approval. If all goes well, we're hoping by the end of the year for the standard to be approved. It may take a little time to get the legal notice of declaration because we have to submit it to be notified in the Gazette. So let us say by end of this year, early February, just in case there's any delays in the Gazette for publishing of the standard. But we will advertise and notify persons when the standard has been published and declared.
Okay. And my last question, when it is published, will the TTBS be offering training for companies?
Yes, it is something that we are looking at. Once there's interest in it, so we'll send out some surveys to ask persons if you would like to have some information, webinars, or in-depth training, or continuous development courses on the risk management, especially for emerging risk, which might be something that is new to persons. So once we have that feedback and stakeholder buy-in, it's something that we can pursue.
Okay, thank you very much.
So I should mention, as if you came in late, the session is being recorded, so I can share the link for the live stream so you can view the entire session and we can share the presentations after.
Thank you.
Awesome. So anyone else has any questions for us? Okay, so I will again emphasize that these documents are there for you to review. So take some time. We'll follow up with you, send out a reminder in the next week or so. Take some time to go through the documents, send us your feedback, particularly on the local application. Do you see there's any information that we should add in terms of local application of these standards? Yes, they're based on international requirements, but things may change from a local application point of view. We may need some additional information. For example, in the ISO 21000, they talk about human and cultural factors that should be considered in risk management. And the committee, we had some discussions on carnival and fetes and other cultural activities and how risk should be considered around these seasonal events. And that's very specific to Trinidad in terms of our risk context and scanning of the horizon there. So let me pause share. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. I think most of you would have my email information, but I will share it after, just to get some more information on the documents. In terms of next steps, as we mentioned, the public comment period for the standard will end on 30th of September. And once that has concluded, we will review the comments as a committee and resolve them as necessary, where we may need to make some updates to the draft standard. Once that has been completed, it will be submitted to our board of directors for approval. And then once we have their approval, we then submit the documentation for the Gazette for the standard to be declared a national standard. So in all things considered, hopefully by the end of this year, early February, we should have this declaration of the standard and it can be published. But as always, if you want to hear any latest developments from the standards, feel free to drop me a line. I do have your email addresses and I can keep you as the participants updated in the progress of the standard. Hi, Betty, I see your hand is up.
Just one last comment from me. My area is actually quality management, yet I will tell people the most important body of knowledge is risk management. This is how valuable I think this body of knowledge is. And this is nothing new. For persons who remember reading the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, the first habit of a highly effective person is to be proactive. And that's what risk management is about. So a suggestion going forward, because I'm amazed that you just have less than 50 persons in this webinar, because again, I know the value of this body of knowledge. And so my suggestion is that going forward, you need to stress on the outcome of risk management. And the outcome of risk management is about value creation and protection. I think if you stress that, you're more than likely, you'll probably have more persons interested in those two terms. This is about value creation and this is about protection of your business. Just a suggestion from me going forward.
Thank you. So I think also what happens to most persons are interested in the training part of the standards part of it, and not so much in the public consultation. But we will take it on board in terms as we go forward in marketing and discussing the standards to let business know this is the impact of what these standards can do for your company and your business. So thank you for that. Okay, so if that is it, I don't see any more hands or questions, but as I say, if you'd like to speak to me one-on-one, you can send me an email or give me a call. Most of you would have my email address at this time, and we will keep you updated on the progress of the standard. Look out for emails from me with copies of the presentations and updates on the progress of the standard. So thank you everyone for coming. Special thanks to Mr. Shazam Idu and Mr. Devendra Chatugun for joining in on our panel discussion to discuss ISO TS 21050. So,
Thank you.